Welcome, whiskey theologians. This is Around the Word in Many Glasses. Today we'll be drinking Redemption High Rye Bourbon, and we'll be talking about the Intertestamental Period. At least we'll be beginning the Intertestamental Period. So sit back, relax, pour yourself a drink. Let's get into it. So my drink for today is Redemption High Rye Bourbon. Should I be pulling these up so that you can look at the bottles and the labels and all that good stuff? Let me know. I don't think I've done it yet, but I don't know if I'm supposed to. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing with just about any of this. So I do actually have a little bit of a story with this whiskey, and it's a bit of an embarrassing one, actually. So I bought this whiskey. This is the second time I've gotten this one, or this bottle. And I bought it the first time because I wanted to try a rye whiskey. And, well, I saw a neat-ish looking bottle in my price range that said High Rye. And so I thought, yeah, if I want to try a rye, I should go with something that has a lot of rye in it. And so I bought it, and I'm going to be honest, I absolutely loved it. I've tried this one again since I've gotten it. It is an excellent bourbon. I got it again thinking it was a rye because I wanted to give ryes another shot. I've been hearing a lot about ryes, been thinking, I've been seeing a lot of ryes on the shelves, and I thought, okay, maybe I can give ryes another try. I remember liking this one, this High Rye Bourbon, and so I thought, well, maybe I'll just try that one again, bring it on to the show, quite frankly. I bought this one to have on here. And that way I can just remind myself what a rye is like, and I can kind of use that as a base to kind of go from there. And therein lies kind of the embarrassment, right? I looked at the label and saw High Rye Bourbon and completely ignored that last word and just assumed that it was a rye. I think if you look on here, right, so the mash bill is what makes this not a rye, quite frankly. I don't know exactly what the cutoff is, but for a bourbon, you have to have, I'm pretty sure the number is over 50% corn. This has 60% corn, 4% barley, and 36% rye. And so it is a bourbon with a lot of rye in it. It's a bourbon with a high rye content, but it's still bourbon. To make this truly embarrassing, Redemption does have a rye, and I looked at the mash bill, and it's 95% rye. I don't know how much. I don't know what the other 5% is. I don't remember. But so to add on from one embarrassment to another, you'll remember I bought this because I wanted a rye that had as much rye as I could get, but I didn't bother to read the mash bill written straight on the front of the bottle. In which case, I would have noted that. The one that just says rye and not high rye had more rye in it. So if you're like me and you wanted to try a rye and you accidentally grabbed a bourbon that just had rye in it, cheers. And I guess I drink to you as well. Now, as much as I do regret not buying a rye like I wanted, this is an excellent bourbon. I really, really like this bourbon. The corn gives it a lot of sweetness, and in fact, I'm going to use words that I kind of know what they mean. The whole palate of this bourbon is that kind of sweet corn. I have another whiskey that I bought. You'll understand why I'm laughing when I do bring it on. It's mellow corn. It's very, very high corn content. Don't know exactly how much. I'll talk about it when I bring it on. It's a yellow bottle with a screw cap. It's great. But it's got the sweetness, but it's got a real punch to it as well that I wasn't expecting. But again, I'll talk about that when I get that. This doesn't have any of that. The palate is just corn sweetness, goes down easy, and then I think the technical term is the finish on this has what I am assuming is what people mean when they talk about rye spice. It almost tastes on the finish like Christmas. And I don't know if um, that feeling, right, that spice cake Christmas sort of thing. I don't know if I'm thinking that because it's early January when I'm filming this, and so Christmas is in the back of my mind, or if that's just what it would taste like otherwise. But if you've um, not tried a bourbon with a lot of rye in it, or even if you're wanting to kind of start into bourbons, but you haven't had a lot of luck, um, or perhaps you've been kind of punched in the face by some of the bourbons, which can certainly um, bourbons can punch you, to be sure. But you want to give it a try. I would recommend Redemption High Rye Bourbon. It's not a rye; it's a bourbon that has rye in it. It really is an excellent, excellent whiskey. I suspect we're not going to see this bottle on this show very often because it's one that I have been reaching for. I've been wanting to reach for it, but I've been holding myself back, thinking, oh, I gotta wait before I drain the bottle, before I start, or before I bring it on to the show. So excellent, excellent whiskey. So the intertestamental period. Shortly after I became pastor at Rivercliff, I filled in for our head pastor who would teach the kind of big group adult Bible study. I have no idea what I taught on. But I think I don't even know if I mentioned it, quite frankly, but what I did mention as I became pastor, I was introducing myself to the congregation, is that my undergraduate degree is in history. So while I'm not a professional historian, I do have a degree in history, so I kind of know what I'm doing. I know just enough to know what I know what I know I'm doing, what I know I don't know what I'm doing. So I'm trying to sort that sentence out. But I mentioned I was a historian. I think that must be where it came from. And one of my members came up. This is shortly after I again became pastor at Rivercliff, and said, I've always been interested in the time in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Intertestamental period. And, she really wanted to have a class on that. I said, yeah, that'd be really interesting. And then I put it to the back of my mind for like a year and a half. Well, not quite. I put it in the back of my mind for about a year. And then it was in the middle of my mind for about 6 months as I planned, okay, this fall, I'm going to teach the teach on the intertestamental period. And that's what I did. This past fall of 2020, over Zoom, I taught the intertestamental period. And I had an absolute blast. This is one of the classes I'm most proud of, which is one of the reasons why it's showing up here. I got a lot of really good feedback. I think this is an area that there's a lot of interest in, but not a lot of research even. Certainly not a lot of classes. Not many people, not many pastors really know a whole lot of details about the intertestamental period. A lot of pastors and a lot of people know very general things that happened, but there is some misunderstandings about what happened during this time frame, and there's just a lot of gaps and holes in people's minds. So for all those reasons and more, I got to dig back into some of my undergraduate history textbooks, which is, it was just so much fun, because I'm a nerd like that. I enjoy reading history textbooks. I really enjoyed teaching the class. And after I finished the class, or even when I was partway through it, I had a lot of people asking if they could take the class or how they could find the class, or saying, oh, they really wish that they had the opportunity to join me. And I have been telling people up until probably in the very near future, once I'm finished with this. My current plan is to actually finish all of the classes before I release any of them, but we'll see how I feel. But a lot of people ask me about this class, and what I've been telling them is that they can find it on the Rivercliff Facebook page, or it should also be on our website, although there's a little bit of a time limit as to how long things are on our website. But so quite frankly, if you want to see my first run through this class, you can go look through the history on our Facebook page, the Rivercliff Lutheran Church Facebook page, and it'll be different. That was a class I taught over Zoom, with other people involved. So I actually had members in that class interacting with me. One, this is going to be shorter because I'm not going to have any of those interactions. There are a couple of tangents we went off on, like the makeup of Alexander the Great's army, because I learned that no one knows what a phalanx is anymore, which is an absolute shame. If you don't know what a phalanx is, look it up before the next class when we talk about Alexander. But for my real, true, ancient world history nerds, you won't need to bother with any of that. But you can go look up the original class on Facebook page. I've made a playlist, so you should be able to find, if you find one of them, you should be able to find all of them in the same section. And I thought for a little bit about just straight uploading those onto a YouTube channel, to this YouTube channel, but partly because this is meant to be a separate thing, and partly because it had other people in it who I told were going on my Facebook page, but I did not say would be going onto a YouTube channel. I didn't quite feel comfortable just uploading those videos. So instead, I'm just going to teach the class again. So this is going to be more highly polished than most of the stuff I'm going to do here, because quite frankly, I've already done all the work for it. I have my outline in front of me on a music stand that I stole from the church. To my music director, sorry if you're looking for it, but I stole it for a little while. Hopefully I'll get it back before you notice. And this video, if you do watch it, will be the first time you find out that I purloined it from the from our music room. But with that, let's get into it. So this first section, my plan is to cover, well, an introduction of the course, the historical conclusion of the Old Testament, and a little bit of what life was like under Persian rule. This session will, for the most part, cover the years between 538 to 330 BC. So just a couple of notes on the dating here. And I'm making these notes not because I think anything less of you, but because, like I said, I have a degree in history, and in my college courses in history, there were people who didn't understand how our timeline works. And so whenever I teach anyone any history, I always teach them how the timeline works. You should know how our timeline works. So for one, the timeline has, you can kind of think of it as positive years and negative years, with the point, I don't know, it's a math word, so I can't think of it. With the focal point that there is no year zero, but year one being what a monk thought the year Jesus was born in. Jesus was probably born in roughly 5 BC. The monk missed a little bit, but he didn't have computers. He did a pretty good bang-up job getting really close to the correct date. And so everything before the birth of Jesus is BC, or before Christ. Or if you're in a secular context and you're a part of, or you're for whatever reason have found this channel, first of all, welcome. I hope you enjoy it. Quite frankly, you don't need to be a believer in any form to enjoy this series. This is a history class. I'll probably talk a little bit about faith, but if you really are in here just for the history and you don't have any time for any of that Christianity stuff, just ignore those sections. I hope you don't, but you can certainly feel free to. But the BC stands for before Christ. For my secular friends out there, you may know this era as BCE, or before the Common Era. And then the dates after Jesus, in my circles, we label as AD, which does not mean after death. That's a pretty common misconception. If it did mean after death, i.e. the death of Christ, it'd be about a 30-year gap. So no, rather, AD is Latin for Anno Domini, which means the year of our Lord. And quite frankly, if you look at like old U.S. documents, quite frankly, some not even that old if people really hold on to tradition. It's a cool way to address letters. They will label them, or they'll date them in the year of our Lord, 1776, or whatever year they want to put there. That's just them saying AD. For the secular friends out there, this is what you will know as CE, or Common Era. If you are secular out there, I ask, why the big deal when it's still focused on the birth of Christ? What secular reason do we have for shifting our timeline there? It's not really to get a big dig at you, but just some friendly banter, I suppose. But this time frame that we'll cover today will begin roughly at 538 BC and end at 330 BC. Now, I realize I'm saying roughly and then giving a pretty precise date. We're going to talk about some stuff that happened before. That's the only reason I'm saying roughly there. The dates that this technically covers is 538 to 330 BC. But before we really deal with the actual content of today's lesson, I want to do a little bit of preliminary work. Answering the question, what is history? Or at least, more specifically, how will I be doing history? Because I think history gets a bad name because of how elementary, middle, and high schools kind of have to do history for educational reasons, which we can talk about another time over perhaps some whiskey or a beer or wine or whatever it is you drink, just not vodka. I don't like vodka. It's horrible. I don't know. Those of you who drink vodka out there, I don't know how you do it. Unless you're pouring it into juice, but that doesn't really count. Does it? But the way I'm going to do history, and what makes history really neat, is not dates and names, right? It's a pretty common complaint about history. It's all about dates and names. I can never remember any of those things. Quite frankly, neither can I. I know the dates I'm using because I have it written in my binder on my music stand that you guys can't see. Now, I, at one point when I was taking a Crusades course, could have told you the day of the week that the Crusaders breached Antioch, the First Crusade, that is. I can't anymore. Because for me, at least, and at the level I'm doing it, history is not about dates and names. Those things are important. Don't get me wrong. They're very useful, and they're good things to have, especially when you're trying to put things in context. But when I do history, and certainly when this course will do history, I'm less interested in dates and names, although we'll need names to keep things straight. I'm more interested in, I guess, what you can call cause and effect. So what prompts people to do what they do, and what are the reasons, as far as we can tell, behind those decisions? Additionally, how do events correlate and interrelate with one another over potentially vast periods of time? This is, I guess, if you can put it one way, you can almost say that history is a traceable butterfly effect. You can see one thing happening in one year, and then 200 years later, someone's doing something, and you think to yourself, and it's a beautiful moment when it happens, oh, I know why they're doing that. It's because of that. That happened 200 years ago. They may not even know that that's why they're doing that, but I know the history. And so I can see why people behave the way they do, even if they're unaware of it. This, by the way, is some of where that popular phrase, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it, comes from. Those who don't know why they're doing things historically are doomed to make dumb decisions, essentially. It's a common joke in historian circles that we just get so frustrated at people because we know what the right decision is, but no one listens to us. Of course, all historians can save the world, right? Of course we can. You all just need to start listening to everything we say. But that's what we're going to be doing in this class. So to give a little bit of an example, this class, the type of history I'm going to be doing here is less concerned with the answer to the question, when was the first crusade? And is much more interested in the question, why did various classes of people actually go on crusade? What were the motivating factors there? And then perhaps what effect does the first crusade have on other things? I wrote a paper for one of my courses about how the Peasants' Crusade, the first wave of the first crusade, really led to modern anti-Semitism. Not what we're going to talk about in this class, but I think that there's a direct historical line between the Holocaust and the First Crusade. It's another thing to talk about over a drink one-on-one. But Again, it's amazing when you can finally make these connections. And I hope that over the course of this class, you can make these connections with individuals in the New Testament. In many ways, this is a New Testament class, because we're going to see what makes people tick. Um, we're going to see how Jesus and his disciples pick some grain in a field on the wrong day of the week, and the Pharisees want to kill him. Seems completely ridiculous to us, but if you understand what has happened over the past 300 or so years, you might say, oh, I see where they're coming from. It doesn't make them right, but you can understand where they're coming from. Why was it that John the Baptist was out in the desert wearing camel skins and yelling about the coming Savior and was washing people in a river? Where in the world did that come from, right? Why do the Pharisees and Sadducees hate each other most of the time, but sometimes work with each other? Why does Pilate act the way he does? We're going to talk a lot about Pilate and maybe get into his mind a little bit. Why is he making the decisions on Holy Week that he makes? You can gather some of this just from the New Testament. But understanding the history that goes into the New Testament really enriches. It's almost like just reading the New Testament is like watching a black and white TV. You can get the whole story. You can see essentially the whole picture. You can get a lot out of it. And you're not going to miss any of the major points. But once you know the intertestamental history, and, well, as a side note, once you know the Old Testament history, well, that's certainly part of this. Once you know the intertestamental history, reading the New Testament, specifically the Gospels, is like watching a show in color. Now it's just so much more vibrant. You can see so much more in the picture that you just were missing before. You may or may not have even known that it was there, but now it's shining straight in your face and you can't really miss it. So that's the kind of history that I prefer to do, I enjoy to do, and that we're going to be doing in this series here. Before we begin, though, I said I am a semi-professional historian, so I want to do this correctly, and I want to give you my sources, so that if you are interested in this, you can go look to the very texts that I used to produce this class. I'm not going to cite things for the most part as I go through the class, just because that wasn't the context that I was working in. I'm not writing a book. This is just an instructional, in this case, video series. But these are my texts. These are my sources that I use before I knock my table over. So the first, and these are in no real particular order, although they do somewhat go from the most used to the least used. So the first is the Apocrypha, the Lutheran edition, with notes and study guide. And this, and the study guide that goes along with it. This is put out by Concordia Publishing House. And if you're only going to get one book, get this one, because it contains almost all of the history in a very shortened, mostly correct form. There are a few places where I think that the individual may have missed some points or gotten a few things not quite on the money, just based on the other sources that I've read. But it's an excellent source, and you get the Apocrypha, which I've only read bits of the Apocrypha, but it's really interesting. The second is the Introduction to the Intertestamental Period by Raymond Serberg. Another reason to get the Apocrypha rather than this book is simply because you get the first half of this book in the introduction to the Apocrypha. So for the most bang for your buck, if you want a book on this topic, is probably going to be the Apocrypha, the Lutheran edition with notes put out by Concordia Publishing House. The next source that I used is the complete and unabridged Josephus. In addition, quite frankly, to Josephus, the Essential Writings, put out by Paul L. Meyer. For the most part, well, on and off, almost depending on my mood for the day, I suppose. I used the Essential Writings, and when I wanted more details, I looked at the full complete edition. I bounced between the two with my Josephus citations, and so, again, if you want bang for your buck or a book that's kind of actually digestible, get The Essential Writings by Paul Meyer. It's an excellent book. In fact, that's the one I was assigned when I was an undergrad. I did a minor in Judaic studies to go along with my history degree, and that The Essential Writings was one of the books that I was assigned there. Next is From the Maccabees to the Mishnah, which is by Shane J.D. Cohen. Jews, God, and History by Ethel, and I apologize if I get this name wrong, Dimont, Dimont. A History of the Jewish People by Ben Sasson. And finally, Advanced Bible History, again put out by Concordia Publishing House. I couldn't find an author on that, although the intertestamental section is only about 3 pages. So there's not an enormous amount of material there. Quite frankly, I got this off a free shelf at the seminary. I don't know if this book is still in print. It's pretty old. But those are the sources that I used. If I pull from other sources, I'll let you know. The one place I did go to, quite frankly, to help me organize and get things that were extraneous straight in my head was Wikipedia. Now, this may come as a shock to some people who, throughout high school, were told that Wikipedia was evil and that they should never use Wikipedia. Now, if you are still in high school or you are in college and they tell you not to use Wikipedia as a source, that's still probably a good idea. However, Wikipedia is crowdsourced. It has people who, for the most part, know what they're talking about on the various articles that are being written. For the most part, extraneous and incorrect information is expunged quickly. And so Wikipedia is not a bad source, but it shouldn't be your primary source or even a secondary source. Use Wikipedia to help sort big concepts that you can't quite manage with the text that you're using. And another fun little trick is most Wikipedia articles have sources at the bottom. Look at those, because this is how you can get out of doing all your research, at least in high school. Go to the Wikipedia page, click on all the sources, and just make those your sources. Because those are people who know what the good sources are. Again, they wouldn't stay there. They'd be crowdsourced out if they were kind of a load of junk. So it's a good place to start if you don't know where to start. The other place is at a library. Libraries with basements that no one's in, those are the best. And that was the UCF history section of the libraries. In a basement, and no one was ever there. And I spent an enormous amount of time there reading stacks of books. It was a wonderful time. Wasn't everyone's undergrad like that? Just reading books in a basement? Or no, just me? All right. So let's actually get into it. Fortunately, this is probably one of the shorter lessons, which is why I can do so much preamble at the beginning. So what did the Holy Land, what did Judea look like at the end of the Old Testament? And this is kind of going to be almost a bullet point list of qualities of Judea after the Babylonians came through. And even at the beginning of when the Persians had come through, we'll talk about that. Again, what the Old Testament, the land of the Old Testament looked like at the end. There was a very scanty population. There have been wars ripping through this land for an enormous amount of time. And there are, as we'll discuss, or there were rather, three separate deportations under the Babylonians, where they flat out picked people up and threw them somewhere else. Almost literally, not quite, but very, very close. And so Judea, or Israel, however you want to title this land, had a very scanty population. It was very sparsely populated. In addition, the cities were almost universally destroyed. Now, they were still there, but they were little more than ruins. We actually see this, that this is the case in Jerusalem in Ezra and Nehemiah. That's partial, specifically Nehemiah. That's kind of the point, is they need to rebuild the city because the Babylonians destroyed it. They were sick and tired of the kingdom of Judah kind of pestering them, giving them problems, and so they just destroyed the city. And they did that not only for Jerusalem, but for most of the city. So Not many people, and the cities have been mostly destroyed. To make matters even worse, the land was in rough shape. Again, armies had been going through, and if you know anything about the Civil War, you'll know that when armies run through, that's the American Civil War. I think we should be careful because we're going to talk about a lot of civil wars in this class. But when armies run through land, they ravage the land. And when they go through land with the intention of doing damage to the land, that's even worse. And then when there are long periods of time after this destruction of armies where there's really no population that has any ability to fix or mend the land, it's a compounding problem. And so the land is scarred. The land is very damaged. The cities are destroyed, and there aren't very many people there. Those who are still in the land, the vast majority of them are incredibly poor, having almost no money, are barely making it day to day, on the verge of starvation. They have nothing. However, there was a very, very small group of individuals who were massively wealthy. Tends to happen in these sorts of situations. This is very much not unique to Israel in this particular context. For the most part, Hebrew has gone out of vogue and has been replaced by Aramaic. Hebrew still exists. Hebrew as a language doesn't technically die until after the Romans come through in 70 AD or CE for this and create the second diaspora. Now you may be asking, I just said Hebrew as a language died, but there are people who today speak Hebrew. There's a whole country, Israel, that national language is Hebrew. And that is also true. An absolutely fascinating story is the rebirth, the resurrection of Hebrew. Because Hebrew is a language that died and then was, as I said, it was brought back to life. It's a really fascinating story. And quite frankly, has been brought back to life since World War II. It was with the founding of Israel, the modern nation state, that Hebrew was resurrected. So it's a really fascinating story. If you want to look into the recreation of Hebrew, it's really interesting, but not what we're talking about today. So for the most part, people are speaking Aramaic. Hebrew still has religious function, but this is why Jesus and the disciples and really everyone in the New Testament is speaking Aramaic. That's the language that everyone speaks. They also speak Greek, but we're not there yet. We'll get to why everyone speaks Greek in the New Testament, why it's the lingua franca in the New Testament. For the Jewish individuals, especially after the return from exile, power has shifted. Power, as you may or may not remember, was vested in the tribe of Judah through the lineage of David specifically. But in the intertestamental period, right at the beginning, even at the end of the Old Testament, those who are in authority are no longer is no longer the tribe of Judah, but is now the tribe of Levi. It's the priests. The priests are the ones who are really in control in both political and religious leadership positions, which is going to be significant way down the road, quite a ways down the road. That sort of thing is going to be a pretty big deal. Overall, as a general summary statement, Judaism in this time period is marked by quote, and I'll be honest, I don't know who I'm quoting here because I didn't write the citation down for some reason, but I am quoting someone. Judaism in this period is marked by, quote, passionate devotion to the God of Israel and avoidance of all polytheism and idolatry. Idolatry and polytheism are a big problem through most of the Old Testament. The Babylonians killed that. That is effectively never a problem for the Jewish people after Babylon. There's going to be some little hints of it throughout this class, but certainly nothing like it was during the reign of the two monarchies, and it will never really come to any major significance. But we'll get to that when we get to it. So, what was life like under Persian rule? Before we get to that, let's just do a little bit of review. How did we get to this situation? So it is during this period that, and this is a Christian viewpoint. Just to kind of put in a disclaimer there, this is when Judaism arises. Judaism was something different beforehand, and it is during the time of the Persians and the Intertestamental Period, and then going forward that Judaism, not quite like we see it today, but much closer to what we see it today, arises. And we'll defend that a little bit as we go, actually a little bit just in a few minutes here. And I will say I do think, and I could be wrong about this, but I think most Jewish historians and Jewish theologians and scholars would say that there's definitely a marked shift during this period in the practice of Judaism. So I don't think this is an unfair assessment. But again, I'm definitely, this is definitely a view that I have from my perspective as a Christian who sees a very marked change that occurs in the life of Christ. I don't even know if secular individuals are going to watch this, but just in case they do, and for those of you who are Christians who may or may not be watching this either, I don't know if this is going to get any views, it is important for us to recognize what other people think. That way we can actually have conversations with people. And conversations are a very good thing to be having. We don't want to shut our ears and stick our head in the sand, especially with people who disagree with us, especially with people who, from our perspective, aren't saved. Those are the people we need to be having the conversations with the most, not the least. Love towards neighbor, all that kind of good stuff. Those during this period that Judaism really begins to emerge, all beginning with the 3 deportations under Nebuchadnezzar. So the exile under Babylon, the Babylonian exile, if you will, is often, for the sake of simplicity, marked as one unit, as one event. But it did take place over 3 phases. Well, specifically 3 deportations, where the Babylonians came in, took people out of Jerusalem, and sent them mostly to Babylon, or to other, they relocated them, essentially. The 3 deportations took place in the years 605, 597, and 587 BC. Furthermore, it's important to note that not all the Israelites were deported. I mean, looking at the Old Testament, Ezekiel wasn't deported. He was still living in Judea after the exile. But so not all of the Jewish individuals were deported. Certainly not in the first wave, but even by the last wave, there were still Jewish people living in Israel. Quite frankly, the ones that the Babylonians didn't bother to deport were the ones that they didn't think were worth deporting. The incredibly poor, for the most part, were the only ones left. The homeless, the destitute, quite frankly, the Babylonians didn't see any point in deporting them, which is part of the reason, not all the reason, it's part of the reason why so many people who are left at the end of the Babylonian exile in the land are fantastically poor. They were poor 70 years before. They're still poor now. That being said, most of those who were deported were very successful in their deportation. They were very successful in exile. They really, for the most part, didn't intermarry. They stayed within the Jewish ethnic group, if you will. And as a result of this, those who went into the Babylonian exile were not lost. You'll sometimes hear of the lost tribes of Israel. These are the 10 northern tribes. Levi was in both, which is 2 southern tribes, 10 northern tribes, and Levi's in each of them. So it counts for both, if you will. So those tribes that were in a part of the Assyrian deportation almost completely were lost. They intermarried and kind of dispersed themselves into the various populations of where they went. Not completely, but the second diaspora definitely knocked out all those tribes. But those who were brought into the Babylonian exile, for the most part, married within their ethnic group. And so were still identifiable as not only Jewish individuals, but within their tribes, by the time they came back from exile. Most notably, well, I guess all three of the tribes that came back were Levi, Judah, and Benjamin, with, of course, Judah and Levi being the most significant of the two, both for messianic and leadership reasons. It's during the Babylonian exile that those religious practices that I mentioned began to shift. They centered primarily on fidelity to the law, and we see this as example with a replacement of the sacrifice with primarily prayer, Sabbath observance, and justice and brotherly relations. Two of those, the Sabbath and the prayer, as well as circumcision, which is kind of added in. Circumcision is kept, but you can't see that from the outside, or at least not easily. Those three are identifying legal marks, if you will, become massively significant throughout the intertestamental period. We'll talk more about them as they gain in their significance. But the religion of sacrifice, or at least the practice of sacrifice, was replaced with prayer, Sabbath observance, fidelity to the law, and those justice and brotherly relationships. So we need to make an aside here. That is to discuss Persia. Where did Persia come from? Who are these individuals? We know they conquer Babylon, at least the biblical reader, but other than that, they come out of nowhere. Fortunately, we do know in fact, we know quite a bit of where Persia came from. So Cyrus the First, who is the first leader of Persia, was originally a vassal of what's known as the Median Empire. For the sake of this class, the Median Empire was in modern day Iran. And we're just going to leave it there. They really won't come into the story again because Cyrus I was a vassal of them. But around the year 550 BC, and we're not entirely sure exactly what year this happened, he overthrew, and are you ready for me to mispronounce this name? Emperor Astyages. I think that's how you say it. That might be wrong. But Cyrus overthrew Emperor Astyages and ended the Median Empire. He is the last emperor of the Median Empire. And Cyrus was able to found what I'm calling the Persian Empire. It has more names, but biblically speaking, at least, the scriptures call them the Persians. Although historically they have a few different names, but I'm just going to call them the Persians for the sake of simplicity. About 7 years later, roughly the year 543, and that's our best guess as to the year, Cyrus took advantage of religious turmoil in Babylon to overthrow the Babylonian Empire. So what was happening in Babylon is that the Babylonian king, not just one, a number of these kings, had been taxing and seizing religious property so that they could pay for, defense. Their empire was crumbling. They were falling apart for a lot of reasons, and they needed money. They needed money to pay soldiers to try at least to keep their crumbling empire together. Cyrus saw that the immense taxing and seizing of religious property made the priests very angry, and was able to leverage that to his advantage, and was able to essentially create a religious uprising. That he came in and wiped out Babylon, kind of took over, and essentially, in one fell swoop, swallowed up the entire Babylonian Empire. What essentially happened, so this is one of these interesting bits of history where you can kind of get to read between the lines a little bit. The priests, during this religious revolt, invited Cyrus in. We don't know the exact circumstances. We don't know exactly how Cyrus leveraged this religious insurrection. We just know that he did. And we do know that the priests were incredibly happy that Cyrus was their new king. We know that they were incredibly happy because we have letters that they wrote. We have some of these priests wrote addresses to the people, and they fawn over Cyrus. well, like I said, let's read between the lines here a little bit. It's entirely possible that these priests absolutely did love Cyrus. He does grant them an enormous amount of religious liberty and religious freedom and stops taxing them more or less. And so he gives them a lot of benefits, and he essentially came to their aid. That being said, the Babylonian Empire was crumbling. They were weak. Cyrus is the new kid on the block. He is the new powerful guy. He's already knocked the Median Empire down, which is a very sizable empire. And now he's walked in and taken over your land. It's probably in your best interest to be a big fan of his, if you kind of get what I'm saying here. And so essentially, we're not entirely sure if these priests were actually really excited for Cyrus to come in, or if they were being smart about what they were saying. In the end, it doesn't really matter here. But likely, because of the because it was religious unrest that allowed Cyrus to conquer Babylon, we see that he set a policy of priestly appeasement. He does, as I mentioned, set policies in place in order to make the priests happy, right? These are the guys that let you get power, so you make them happy, so you stay in power, is essentially what's going on here. We're going to see this sort of thing happening throughout various leadership changes in the Old Testament. So by the year 538, Cyrus had consolidated power over his newly acquired Babylonian Empire, now the Persian, or part of the Persian Empire, and he began a policy of what I'm going to call restoration. He looked to all of the people that the Babylonians had conquered, because they conquered a lot of people and deported them as well. And so he looked to those people and put them back, let them go back to their ancestral homelands, if you will. We can see this as yet another move for Cyrus to endear himself to a newly conquered people. Again, he's the new leader. These people really don't have any reason to care for him, to love him, or even to fear him, because he wasn't one who conquered them. And so we see in this resettlement, this restoration, Cyrus kind of giving them the carrot, if you will. And this was a phenomenally successful program. We will see a little bit today, and especially more in the next lesson, that it's worked very well, especially with the Jewish people. They will never turn against the Persians, ever. The Persians will crumble before the Jewish people turn against them. So it worked. It worked very well. And so then the year 538 marks the official return from exile with what is known as the Edict of Cyrus. It's at this point that exiles are brought back, and they bring their religious reforms with them from Babylon to Judea. And there are, just as there were 3 waves of exile, there are 3 waves of return as well. And so we see a return in the year 538. We see a return led by Ezra of the Old Testament in the year 457, and another return led by Nehemiah, also of the Old Testament, in the year 445. During his tenure as governor, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. It's during this time, during these returns, that the Levitical priests take over, if you will, politically. They gain and grab political authority, and it's now the priests who are running the show rather than the remnant of the royal family. Because there were members of the royal family who returned, obviously, because Christ comes from the royal line. You can read about that at the end of Second Chronicles, I believe. Certainly at the end of Second Kings. The name of the actual individual is escaping me. I think it's Jehoiachin. Forgive me if that is incorrect. During his tenure as governor, because Nehemiah did come back as governor, we have an incident take place. Nehemiah ousts an individual known as Tobias. Tobias was an Ammonite who had been living in the temple, and he fled to Samaria, and at that point transcribed what came to be known as the Samaritan Pentateuch. So we see at this point in time, the Samaritans are beginning to form. They, for all intents and purposes, did not exist before the Intertestamental period. Now, certainly the people in the ethnic groups did, but a people known as the Samaritans, this is really not quite, but this is essentially the beginning of the Samaritan people group. Around the early 450s BC, so we're fast forwarding here a little bit, both Egypt and Greece began applying military pressure against the Persian Empire. And this caused quite a significant number of problems for the Persian Empire. Yet, in spite of the now beginning to crack and crumble Persian Empire, at least on a major scale, the Jewish people remained incredibly loyal. As I said, they never waver in their loyalty to Persia. In fact, there's even a story. There's well, it's more than a story. There's a dig site at a community known as Elephantine, which is in Egypt. It's a Jewish colony that is there. It's an archaeological site now. And best we can tell, this was a military garrison of Jewish colonists in Egypt to protect the interests of Persia. So it seems that the Jewish individuals were actually more than just loyal. They were serving in the military. They were serving as vanguards for the Persian Empire. Now, the next story, and the one I'm going to effectively conclude here with, has a number of different versions that you can get from various different sources. The one I'm going to tell is a slightly edited version of Josephus's account. I'm using Josephus's because he gives good details. His details, for the most part, align with most of the historical sources. However, I have changed one detail because, as far as I can tell, Josephus got the date wrong. Josephus believes for this to have occurred during the reign of Artaxerxes II, which would have taken place during the rule of Nehemiah. However, it's almost certainly happened right near the end of Persian rule during the reign of Darius III. We're going to talk about Darius III next week. So during the reign of Darius III, there was a dispute in the temple in Jerusalem over the current high priest, who was named Jonathan. The general, I'm skipping my lines here. My goodness, I have the notes here. All I have to do is read them. I'm not doing that well. Jonathan was a friend of a Persian general who, make a long story short, was killed during this dispute over the high priest, over Jonathan. And so the general came in to deal with this problem, and he was not allowed into the temple. He was, after all, a Gentile, so he was not allowed to go into the temple. But he forced his way in and imposed a sacrifice tax. The son of the high priest, the son of Jonathan, when Jonathan died, he became high priest and was assisted by his brother, Manasseh. This is where things get a little bit complicated. We're talking about the sons of Jonathan here. Manasseh was married to the daughter of a Persian satrap. Satrap, one of the two. Essentially a Persian governor. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but we'll leave it there. This Persian governor's name was Sanballat, and the people were not pleased with this, right? Even throughout the Babylonian captivity, they weren't intermarrying, so why should the brother of the high priest be intermarrying with Gentiles? It was, in the people's eyes, wrong. They were furious and even rebelled because Manasseh had his foreign wife, and he was in that role of assisting the high priest. And the people ousted him from Jerusalem in this minor rebellion. Manasseh then appealed to Sanballat, that satrap, and with his help, Manasseh resettled on Mount Gerizim. Now, if you're a student of the New Testament, that's probably familiar because it was on Mount Gerizim that Manasseh founded a temple of which he became high priest, naturally, known during the era of the New Testament as the Samaritan Temple. And so when Jesus meets the Samaritan woman, she says, well, we go worship on Mount Gerizim. This is what she is referring to. And this, right near the end of the Persian rule, is roughly when this happened. And we're starting to see, and it's going to become more significant, a rift forming between the Samaritans and the Jewish people. There's no accident that these two groups of people don't like each other in the New Testament. But we'll deal with those those relations as we get to them. So to wrap up the Persian Empire, the Persian rule, the last 100 years of Persian rule were for the most part mired with revolts and crumbling military strength. The Persians were starting to fall apart. But again, even in the midst of it, Judea never revolted. Even when Alexander comes through, the Judeans don't revolt. We'll talk about that next week. And then starting with the reforms of Nehemiah and the rise of the Levites, a significant emphasis, as we said, has been placed on commitment to the Sabbath, as well as a number of other religious practices, right? Prayer, circumcision, those sorts of things. And it's these intense religious dedications to these to the Sabbath and a few other things that really sets the people of Israel visibly apart from everyone else. And these visible differences, particularly in religious practice, are going to become a major sparking and fusing point as we go on through the various lessons here. So next time I record one of these videos and post it, we'll go on to our next class, where we will be talking about Alexander the Great and his conquest, because who doesn't like talking about Alexander the Great? But until then, all you who wait on the Lord, raise a glass as we drink to the imminent return of